Welcome to At Midnight, the late-night dive into history, myths, and legends. Tonight, old Chinese accounts begin before heaven and earth have settled into their usual paperwork. Then follow makers, repairers, dragons, immortals, and judges through a cosmos with an impressive number of offices. The stories do not belong to one tidy canon, which is fortunate, because tidy can be rather dull. This is At Midnight. Let's step into the dark. It is awkward to begin with heaven and earth when neither one has yet settled into being itself. In one hand text, the Hy non-Diza, the familiar divisions have not arrived. There is no finished sky above, no firm ground below, no stable collection of things with names and edges. The account begins with a condition in which forms are not yet distinct. That opening matters because it declines the convenience of a single maker standing at the first moment. It does not offer a ruler with a plan, a family tree, or a neat beginning that can be placed at the front of every later story. It offers something less tidy and perhaps more patient. An undifferentiated condition before the world has separated itself into the categories by which people usually live. The Hy non-Diza is associated with the court of Liu N and is traditionally dated to 139 before the Common Era. Its account belongs to that particular work. It should not be made to carry the entire weight of Chinese mythology, a subject formed through many texts, practices, places, and centuries. But it gives a remarkably quiet place to start. Before a world can be governed, repaired, mapped, prayed to, or judged, it must first become a world with differences inside it. The text speaks of qi, a word often used for vital material or breath. Here it is not a small private breath held by one person. It is part of the stuff through which the cosmos becomes differentiated. The account then gives two deities the work of separating yin and yang. These are not simple labels for good and bad. They are paired cosmological terms, a way of describing complementary qualities whose distinction helps make order possible. Once distinction begins, the scene acquires a kind of structure. The heavy and the light are no longer merely mixed without form. The text describes beings forming from turbid qi and humans forming from refined qi. Its sequence is not a modern explanation of matter, life, or anatomy. It is a literary and cosmological way of imagining that the human world belongs within a larger patterned process. A person is not placed outside the cosmos as a late spectator. Human life appears within the same account of differentiation. There's a temptation to make this first movement sound like a grand explosion. The Hy non-Diza does not need that treatment. Its force comes from the opposite direction. It asks what must happen before anything can be recognized at all. A direction needs another direction to distinguish it. A body needs a world in which it can have a place. Heaven and earth need not be eternal furniture in the room. In this account, their separation is part of the story. That also gives the old text a useful resistance to later habits. A modern retelling may prefer a single famous creator, then arrange every other figure in a line behind that creator. The surviving materials do not cooperate so easily. The Hy non-Diza has its own vision of a beginning. Other works have other visions. Later images and stories will give familiar figures different roles, different appearances, and different settings. The lack of one universal opening is not a flaw in the material. It is the material. For the moment, the important action is small enough to miss. Things become unlike one another. What was without settled form becomes capable of pattern. Yin and yang are separated. Qi is described in differing conditions. Beings emerge. Human beings emerge from refined qi. The account gives no need to force a later story into this space. Its first question is not who ruled the finished cosmos. Its question is how a cosmos could begin to have a finished form at all. This is a world understood through relation. Light makes sense beside heavy. Refined makes sense beside turbid. Heaven and earth make sense once they are distinct rather than mingled. The act of naming does not create the whole scene from nothing, but it follows the appearance of differences that can be named. A calm order begins there, in the possibility that one thing can answer another without losing its own character. The Hy non-Diza was not written as a scientific manual, and it does not ask to be read as one. Its language works by correspondence and arrangement. A text of this kind does not begin by separating material description from moral or social reflection in the way a modern reader might expect. It uses the movement from formlessness to differentiation to establish an intelligible world. That movement has no need for haste. The account does not give a timestamp for the first distinction, nor does it ask a reader to calculate the speed at which light rose or heavy matter settled. Its concern is sequence as a way of thinking. Before difference, no ordered world can be described. Once difference has appeared, relation becomes possible. Yin can be set beside yang. Heaven can stand apart from earth. Human beings can be given a place among other beings. Even the word order can be heard in two ways. It may suggest stability, but it also suggests a continuing act of arrangement. Things remain intelligible because their distinctions are held in relation. The source imagines a cosmos that can be patterned without being reduced to a mechanical device. Its qi is not an inert substance waiting for a later explanation. It is part of a language for speaking about transformation, refinement, and emergence. The first section of this long path therefore begins before any divine court has paperwork, before a dragon can be assigned a rank, and before a deceased person can travel through a court. It begins with the simpler difficulty of naming a world that is not yet settled enough to be named. The Han account gives a solution through differentiation, then quietly brings that solution close enough to touch. The order of this account is worth retaining. First comes formlessness, then separation, then the emergence of beings. It is not a tale about a single household of gods whose relations explain the whole world. It is a meditation on becoming distinct. Its deities separate yin and yang, but the text's attention stays on the ordered world that separation permits. It presents a beginning as a condition of relation rather than a scene of conquest. The account also has room for human beings without making them the reason the cosmos exists. Humans form from refined qi within a broader process that also forms other beings from turbid qi. The contrast gives human life a place in the pattern without requiring it to stand above every other form. The cosmos has not been made merely to receive a human observer. It has differentiated, and humans belong within the differentiation. Later in the same passage, the large arrangement draws nearer. The newly formed cosmos is not left overhead or far away. It is reflected in the proportions and openings of a human body, as if the vast pattern had found a smaller place in which to continue. The vast pattern had found a smaller place in which to continue, and the hand text introduced earlier takes that comparison seriously. Its world is not arranged at a distance from human life. The body itself becomes a way of thinking about the order of heaven and earth, not as a specimen in a physician's room, but as a patterned form within a patterned cosmos. The Hy non-Diza places 4 limbs beside the 4 seasons. It places 5 viscera beside 5 phases. It places 9 openings beside 9 divisions, and 366 joints beside the days of the year. The correspondences move in both directions. A body is small enough to touch, tire, feed, and shelter. The year is too large to hold in a hand. Yet the text lets one answer the other through number and arrangement. These claims are literary and cosmological claims within the text. They are not scientific observations waiting to be confirmed by a later anatomy lesson. That distinction leaves the passage more interesting, not less. It shows a writer imagining the body as an ordered field, capable of being set alongside seasons, phases, divisions, and days. The comparison is an act of thought. It makes a human life intelligible as part of a larger order rather than a stray event inside it. The 4 limbs give the pattern a simple beginning. A year turns through 4 seasons, each with a recognizable place in its sequence. The text sees an echo of that sequence in the body's 4 extended parts. Then the 5 viscera are placed beside the 5 phases, another framework for thinking about change and relation. The 9 openings and the 366 joints carry the same habit farther. Nothing in the body is merely isolated. Each feature can be read as belonging to a wider arrangement. Such a scheme can seem severe when reduced to a list. In the text, though, the list is a way of making a world inhabited. The earlier condition of unformed qi has become a cosmos, whose patterns can be found again in human form. The imagination behind it does not separate private life from the order of the world. A body has seasons in its analogies, divisions at its edges, a calendar in its joints. It is a small answer to a large question. There's also something careful in the method. The passage does not claim that a person controls heaven and earth. The human body is not presented as a little emperor issuing commands to the sky. It is placed within correspondences. That is a more modest role. The body matters because it participates in order, and because its own patterns offer a way to contemplate patterns beyond it. The same idea prevents the early material from becoming a flat creation scene. The Hy non-Diza is not simply interested in what came first. It asks how a differentiated cosmos might be held together. Seasons recur, days accumulate. A body is formed with countable features. The numbers do not turn the passage into bookkeeping, although the cosmos clearly has a fondness for organization. They make relation visible through a sequence that can be remembered. This way of reading also makes caution necessary. It would be easy to take one correspondence, give it a permanent symbolic meaning, and carry that meaning through every later image and ritual. The sources do not grant such easy permission. Other traditions use other terms, other figures, and other arrangements. The hand text preserves one powerful account of connections between person and cosmos. It does not provide a single master key for every story that would later be told in Chinese settings. Still, the passage offers a gentle form of scale. A human body has limits. It has limbs, organs, openings, and joints. The cosmos has seasons, phases, divisions, and days. The comparison does not erase the distance between them. It makes the distance legible. A person can stand in a world too large to contain in thought, and find that the same habit of arrangement has been imagined close at hand. The pattern has another consequence. It makes the human form neither insignificant nor all-powerful. The body is not a private object sealed off from the world, but neither is it a miniature universe with command over everything beyond it. The comparison offers belonging. It says that the human scale can be understood through the same pleasure in relation that organizes the larger scale. That idea is useful for a sleep narration because it can remain at an even pace. 4 limbs, 5 viscera, 9 openings, and 366 joints are not a riddle with a hidden prize. They are a sequence of correspondences. The passage asks the mind to move from the known shape of a body outward towards seasons and days, then back again. The motion is orderly rather than urgent. It also keeps a great deal of later material in perspective. Later stories will give individual figures vivid acts to perform. Nuwa will repair a damaged sky. Pangu will divide light from heavy. Gods will have offices, and the dead will have courts. The Hy non-Diza in this moment is interested in the underlying possibility that such a world can be patterned at every scale. Its human body is a small cosmos only in the sense that both are made readable through relation. There is no need to decide whether the correspondences are elegant or strange by modern standards. They do the work they were made to do within the text. They bind a person to time, direction, and sequence. The body becomes a quiet reminder that a world of distinction is never merely outside the skin. This does not require a claim that every later healing practice, ritual, or image repeats the exact scheme. The Hy non Diza passage has its own literary setting. Its 4, 5, 9, and 366 are a particular way of relating the body to a patterned cosmos. The strength of the passage lies in its confidence that analogy can connect scales, which ordinary experience keeps apart. The correspondences also encourage attention rather than mastery. A joint can suggest a day without becoming a clock. A limb can suggest a season without becoming weather. The relation is contemplative. It draws the mind toward a world in which the human form is neither accidental nor autonomous, but one patterned presence among many. The text gives no clean separation between a cosmic pattern and the life that experiences it. A season passes outside a body, but it is also part of a system to which the body has been compared. Time becomes something carried in analogy. That makes the passage less a claim about measurement than a way of feeling proportion. Order, however, is only reassuring while it lasts. A sky can be distinguished from earth, directions can be restored, and a body can be placed among seasons. Yet, an old account can also imagine those supports failing. When that happens, the problem is no longer how patterns begin, but how a damaged world might be made whole again. When a damaged world must be made whole again, the question of order becomes practical. In an ancient account associated with the Hy non Diza, Nuwa appears not as the uncontested creator of every human being, but as the figure who confronts a cosmos whose supports have failed. The situation is described in broad, unsettling terms. A cosmic support collapses. Fire and flood threaten. The directions that had helped make the world intelligible are disturbed. Fierce creatures belong to the troubled setting as well. The account does not linger over any of it, and neither need the telling. Its real interest lies in what follows, because Nuwa's work is repair. She uses stones of 5 colors to mend the sky. The image is compact and durable. A broken expanse overhead, colored material gathered for a task, and a figure who does not remake everything from the beginning, but restores what has come apart. The stones are not merely decoration. In the story, they belong to the work of returning the world to order. That distinction gives Nuwa a different kind of presence from a maker at the first instant. The earlier Han cosmogony imagined forms becoming distinct through the separation of yin and yang and the differentiation of qi. Here the world is already formed enough to suffer damage. It has directions, supports, and living creatures. Its danger comes from disorder within a cosmos that had possessed an order worth recovering. The account is often retold as though it supplied a complete and universal origin story. The accessible extract tied to the Hy non Diza supports a narrower and more compelling claim. It preserves a restoration myth. Nuwa acts in a specific ancient narrative of collapse and repair. It does not settle what every community believed, and it does not require a single genealogy into which every other creator or culture hero must be placed. There is a particular calm in the choice of mending. A damaged roof is not made less damaged by a speech about its original perfection. A broken support needs to be set right. The colored stones give the myth a material answer to a cosmic problem. They are gathered, applied, and made to hold. The world resumes enough of its order for directions to be meaningful again. This is not an account of effortless power. The narrative gives Nuwa a task because something has gone wrong. The scale is enormous, but the action remains recognizable. Repair means attention to break. It means treating instability as a condition that can be answered, even if it cannot be explained away. The myth's restraint comes from that focus. It does not need to make the crisis louder than the work. Nuwa's presence also complicates the wish for a single stable category. In one setting, she is the repairer of the sky. In later images, she appears beside Fuxi in forms that carry their own histories. A textual act and a visual tradition need not say the same thing in the same way. They can preserve different aspects of how a figure was imagined, and they can change as the objects and audiences around them change. The repaired world is not presented as permanently safe. Old stories rarely promise that much, but the account allows order to return after disruption. Fires and floods recede from the center of the narration. The 5 colors remain. The directions are reestablished. The scene becomes less about calamity than about the patient fact that a broken arrangement was made coherent again. The story's scale should not conceal its practical imagination. Nuwa is given a material, a task, and a result. The stones have colors, the sky has a break, and the directions can be reestablished. This is a cosmic event, but it is told through the ordinary logic of repair. A world is not restored by declaring that damage did not occur. It is restored through work that meets the damage where it is. The 5 colors can be allowed to remain colors. Later readers may wish to attach a complete symbolic system to them, but the source base here does not require that. Their presence gives the act a tangible quality. A sky, too immense to handle, is approached through pieces of stone. The contrast between the material and the cosmic is exactly what keeps the scene memorable. The broken supports also make the earlier body cosmos pattern feel less secure. If order can be imagined in limbs, seasons, and directions, it can also be imagined as vulnerable. That vulnerability is not a contradiction. It gives restoration a purpose. The world matters enough for its damage to require attention. The account does not offer a permanent guarantee against future disorder. Its restoration is an event within a myth, not a contract with history. Yet it retains a measured confidence that coherence can return. The directions are not left confused. The sky is not left open. The story lingers on the act that makes a habitable arrangement possible again. Nuwa's work is also different from simple command. The narrative gives no need for a ruler's proclamation or a complete new creation. A repairer addresses a failure in an existing world. That gives the myth a distinctive emotional shape. It recognizes disorder, then turns away from its details toward the labor of restoring a pattern. The 5 colored stones make the labor visible without making it mechanical. They are small enough to gather and specific enough to remember. Their colors keep the scene from becoming only an abstraction about cosmic stability. The myth lets material things meet an immense problem, which is perhaps why the image has endured so well in later retelling. The restored directions matter because direction is a basic way of living in a world. Once directions fail, place loses its ordinary confidence. Nuwa's action makes orientation possible again. The account is not interested in explaining every consequence. It simply lets the world become ordered enough to continue. That is enough for the story to carry. It does not need a modern moral pinned onto it, and it does not need to turn Nuwa into a fixed emblem with one meaning for all time. The ancient text gives a repairer, a damaged sky, and colored stones. Later people carried figures like Nuwa into other media, where objects rather than a single narrated episode begin to do much of the talking. Objects rather than a single narrated episode begin to do much of the talking when Nuwa appears beside Fuxi. A study hosted by the Chinese Academy of History follows a durable visual convention in which the 2 figures are paired, and its evidence asks for a different kind of attention from the repair story. In images from the Han through Tang periods, Fuxi and Nuwa often have human heads and serpent-like bodies. They may appear entwined or placed together in a form that makes their pairing hard to ignore. Sometimes a sun and moon accompany them. Sometimes they hold a compass and a square. The figures do not speak in these images, at least not in the manner of a written tale. Their forms and objects carry the work of relation. Fuxi enters this visual tradition as Nuwa's paired figure, a culture hero seen in company with the repairer from the earlier account. The pairing should not be rushed into a universal family history. The study records a long visual convention, not a final answer to every question about origin, worship, or kinship. Images have their own evidence. They preserve choices made by artists and the settings in which those choices continued to matter. The compass and square are especially tempting. They seem to offer immediate explanations, as though 2 tools could settle the whole meaning of the figures. The study proposes a relationship between the visual tradition and cosmological order. That is a useful reading, particularly because measuring implements sit so naturally beside paired figures and celestial signs. But symbolic interpretation varies. The objects cannot be made into proof of a single doctrine, nor can they demonstrate a definite prehistoric technology simply because they appear in an image. The serpent-bodied forms demand similar patience. They are not literal portraits. They do not require a modern observer to decide whether the figures ought to be classified as human, animal, divine, or something neatly between. The image works through a joining that declines those easy boundaries. Human heads meet serpentine bodies. A paired relation is expressed through shared composition. Sun and moon may frame the scene without turning it into a diagram, with only one correct reading. This is one reason visual history matters so much in stories of myth. A text can preserve a sequence of actions. A support falls, stones are used, order returns. An image can preserve posture, proximity, costume, tools, and form. Neither should be forced to become the other. The written repair account does not tell every visual detail, and the paired images do not need to be treated as illustrations of one sentence from one book. The Hantatang span noted by the study also gives the convention duration. It was not a single accidental arrangement. Yet duration is not sameness. A repeated form can be received differently across centuries, in different places, by different viewers and makers. The paired figures endured as a recognizable visual language, while the meanings attached to them could remain open enough for later interpretation. There's a quiet order in the composition. The compass and square suggest measurement without requiring a lecture on measurement. The sun and moon suggest a larger frame without requiring a complete astronomy. The entwined figures make relation visible without delivering a fixed doctrine. Old images are often patient in this way. They allow a viewer to linger with a form that means more than one sentence can contain. Nuwa's earlier work had restored directions to a damaged cosmos. Here, alongside Fuxi, she belongs to a visual world in which order is proposed through implements, paired bodies, and celestial companions. The connection is suggestive, not conclusive. It is enough to notice that the figures could be made to inhabit a cosmos of proportion and relation. The images also give time a different texture from a written sequence. A narrative moves through actions: collapse, repair, separation, return. A paired visual form can hold several relations at once. Fuxi and Nuwa share a composition. Their bodies, implements, and celestial companions can be considered together without requiring one event to follow another. The image gives thought a place to pause. That pause is valuable because it prevents overconfident translation. The compass and square do not become a sentence with one fixed subject and object. The serpentine bodies do not become a report about biology. The sun and moon do not become a complete cosmological manual. Each element can contribute to an impression of relation and order, while leaving room for historical variation in interpretation. The study's attention to the visual convention reminds us that mythic material survives through making as well as copying. An artist's choice of line, form, and placement can preserve a figure for later viewers, even when no accompanying narration explains every choice. The survival of an image does not remove uncertainty, but it gives uncertainty a shape. Fuxi and Nuwa, then, need not be made to stand still for a final portrait. The earlier textual repair story and the later paired images are connected by the figure of Nuwa, but they are not identical evidence. The difference is instructive. A figure can remain available across media, while the medium changes what can be said. The paired form is especially resistant to a single hierarchy. Neither figure needs to be treated as a background companion to the other. The composition makes relation visible first. It lets their shared presence carry a meaning that cannot be reduced to one person's action. The human heads and serpent bodies belong to the visual convention as a whole, not to a problem that must be explained away. The CASS study traces the convention across a considerable span, and that duration is itself a fact about reception. Figures were not only preserved in written accounts, they were made present repeatedly in images. A convention can endure because it remains capable of being recognized and reused, even while viewers may attach different understandings to it. That is why images deserve the same source-conscious care as texts. They are neither decorative leftovers nor direct windows into a settled belief. They are historical works that preserve form, relation, and choice. Their evidence is partial, but it is evidence nonetheless. The convention did not remain unchanged. The same study observes a later turn in the portrayal of Fuxi, when the paired serpent-bodied culture hero could appear in a quite different guise. That alteration does not erase the older images. It simply leaves them where they belong, as one enduring form among several ways. An old figure could be given a body. One enduring form among several ways, an old figure could be given a body, is still not the end of Fuxi's visual history. The culture hero scene, beside Nuwa in earlier conventions, appears differently in a song period development noted by the same Chinese Academy of History Study. Here Fuxi can stand alone as a human emperor. The serpent-bodied pairing is no longer the form carrying the whole image. He is presented in an unmistakably human shape, with the bearing of a ruler, and with a Tai Ji Ba Gua disc. The disc brings together the familiar paired principle of Taiji and the Bagua, the 8 trigrams. It makes the change in representation difficult to dismiss as a minor adjustment of costume. The older paired images do not vanish simply because this later form appears. They remain evidence of a long convention in which Fuxi and Nuwa were shown together with human heads and serpentine bodies. The song period image does something else. It allows Fuxi to appear as a solitary human emperor, and it gives the figure an object that directs attention toward an organized cosmological scheme. The study's observation is historical rather than total. It does not prove that every artist, community, or text abandoned one appearance for another at the same moment. It does not turn the image into a census of belief. A tradition can hold more than one representation at once, especially when it moves through different media, regions, patrons, and purposes. The value of the change is that it makes such movement visible. There is a human desire to arrange mythic figures as though they were members of one family assembled for a formal portrait. One figure must be oldest, another must be a child or spouse, and a third must come afterward to finish the story. The surviving materials are more unruly. Nuwa's repair account belongs to an ancient textual setting. Fuxi's visual forms change across periods. Pangu's well-known creation story has its own later written trail. None of that gives an uncontested family chronology. The Song period Fuxi offers a small lesson in historical caution. An image of a human emperor can feel more familiar to later habits of imagining authority than a pair of serpent-bodied forms. That familiarity may tempt a viewer to regard the later image as clearer, more finished, or more authentic. But an old figure does not become more original merely by becoming easier to classify. The image records a different way of giving Fuxi presence. The Tai Ji Ba Gua disc also resists being treated as a simple label. It belongs to a visual composition that gives Fuxi a cosmological aspect, but no single object can settle every meaning attached to the figure. The earlier compass and square invited similar caution. Images can make a claim through arrangement without handing over a complete verbal explanation. Their silence is not empty. It is part of the evidence. There is no need to decide which Fuxi is the real one. The paired serpent-bodied form and the solitary human emperor both belong to histories of representation. Each tells something about how an old culture hero could be understood in a particular visual setting. The shift is not a flaw to be repaired into consistency. It is a record of transmission, of a figure remaining available for revision rather than sealed inside one ancient appearance. That is also why it is risky to begin every account of this material with a confident chart of creators. Fuxi, Nuwa, and Pangu do not arrive from the sources as a settled sequence. Their stories and images have distinct dates, genres, and afterlives. A narrative can place them near each other for the sake of thought, but it should not pretend that proximity proves a single shared origin. The difference between the two visual forms also helps avoid an easy language of replacement. Historical change is often described as if one image marched in, dismissed an earlier one, and closed the door. The evidence named by the study is better suited to a quieter account. A song period shift can be noticed without assuming that all older forms ceased to exist, or all viewers agreed on what the shift meant. The human emperor form gives Fuxi a new proximity to political authority. That proximity may have made the figure useful in a setting where rulership offered an intelligible visual model. But the source does not require a complete explanation of every motive behind the image. It is enough to observe the form. Fuxi alone, human in appearance, associated with a Tai Ji Ba Gua disc. The change also makes chronology harder to misuse. A later image can feel authoritative because its ruler-like form is so direct, but clarity of appearance is not proof of original priority. The paired images and the song period figure belong to different moments in a visual history. Each must be allowed its own setting. The disc provides a focal point without exhausting the image. It makes cosmological order visible as part of Fuxi's portrayal, while the Emperor form gives that order a human bearer. Together, they create a different emphasis from the earlier paired convention. The source supports observation of this shift, not a final explanation of all its meanings. The older paired form had made relation central. The later form makes singular authority more visible. Neither needs to be called a correction of the other. They are different ways of organizing a figure in an image. One preserves a paired, serpent-bodied convention. The other presents an emperor-like person with a cosmological object. The contrast shows that mythic authority can be reimagined without becoming wholly unrecognizable. It is also a reminder that a familiar name is not a guarantee of a fixed identity. Fuxi can be known through an image, but the image's date, composition, and setting shape what that name can mean in the moment. Old figures remain old partly because later periods keep finding new forms for them. The visual change is therefore not a footnote to the figure. It is part of the evidence that myths have histories of their own, visible in the bodies and objects artists give them. Fuxi's altered appearance leaves an old question quietly open. If a figure can be remade by changing image, then a famous creation story can also have a history more complicated than its familiarity suggests. Pangu waits in that space, inside a tale whose written record arrives later than the confident simplicity of the tale might imply. The familiar Pangu story gives that problem a figure and an enclosure, a cosmic egg in which the usual divisions have not yet been drawn apart. Its surviving written witnesses, rather than the story's later familiarity, set the historical question at the beginning. Within that egg is Pangu. When the separation comes, light elements rise and heavy elements settle. Heaven and earth become distinct through the division. It is a powerful story because it gives separation a body and a worker. What the Hy non-Diza had described through the differentiation of chi is imagined here through a figure acting within a cosmic enclosure. The egg is not merely a convenient prop. It holds together the condition that must be divided. Light and heavy are mixed before Pangu's act gives them different places. The image makes cosmology physical. A world does not simply appear in finished form. It must be opened, sorted, and held apart. In later parts of the familiar narrative, Pangu dies, and his body becomes features of the world. Breath, voice, eyes, blood, hair, and limbs are among the elements that versions of the tale transform into natural phenomena. The pattern is one of conversion rather than disappearance. A body that had helped establish the world becomes part of the world it established. That broad pattern should not be mistaken for one untouchable ancient record. The Oxford reference summary used for this story identifies surviving written accounts in the 3rd century San Wu Li Ji and the 6th century Shu Yi Ji. Those texts are later than the Han Hy non-Diza introduced at the beginning. The comparison does not diminish Pangu. It simply keeps distinct the date of a familiar story's surviving written forms and the date of an earlier account that begins without him. The dates also make room for a useful distinction between a story and its surviving witnesses. A tale can feel ancient because its images are spare and memorable, while the texts available to modern readers belong to a known historical period. The San Wu Li Ji and Shu Yi Ji tell us that versions of Pangu's story were written down in the 3rd and 6th centuries. They do not supply a full record of every prior telling, nor do they allow a later reader to treat the familiar narrative as the first account of cosmic beginnings. The evidence is narrower than either claim. It preserves a story of separation, a body transformed into natural features, and a written history that can be compared with the earlier Han account. That is enough to give Pangu a clear place without making him carry every beginning. It would go too far to say that Pangu's story had no older oral existence. Surviving texts cannot settle that question. Oral traditions leave uneven traces, and a written attestation is not a complete biography of a myth. But it would be equally misleading to call Pangu the earliest Chinese creation account on the basis of a modernly familiar version. The evidence allows a more modest statement. The familiar written accounts preserved for this narrative are comparatively late. The distinction changes the feeling of the story. Pangu is not required to stand at the front of every later tradition as the one source from which all other figures proceed. He can remain what the surviving accounts make him, a striking creation figure whose tale gives form to separation, and whose transformed body supplies a world of natural features. There's a strange economy in that image. Mountains, waters, weather, and the contours of the land need not be introduced one by one as separate possessions. They can arise from the changed remains of a single cosmic body. The tale does not ask for scientific assent. It asks for the imaginative recognition that a world can be made from what once had another form. The Pangu account also has a different emotional texture from Nuwa's repair. Nuwa met a world already damaged and used colored stones to restore its order. Pangu belongs to a tale in which division itself makes ordered space possible. The two stories may be placed near each other in later retelling, but their actions and textual histories remain distinct. One should not be recruited to explain the other. Pangu's story is often remembered because it provides images that are easy to carry. An egg, a division, and a body becoming a world. Its ease of recollection can disguise the careful historical question behind it. A story's popularity in modern retelling is not evidence that its surviving written form is the earliest available account. The distinction has no need to make the tale less beautiful. It gives the tale a history. The written record also changes how certainty should sound. The 3rd century San Wu Li Ji and 6th century Shu Yi Ji are anchors for surviving versions, not windows through which every prior telling can be seen. There may have been earlier oral forms. The surviving material cannot settle the matter. The responsible answer is not a blank refusal, but a boundary around what the texts permit. Within that boundary, Pangu's action remains vivid. The tale imagines a figure whose labor is cosmological and bodily at once. His act of separation creates distinct places for light and heavy, and the later transformation gives landscape a human source without requiring a detailed inventory of every hill or stream. It is a world-making image, not a geological claim. The resulting world has room for stories that do not require Pangu to appear again. Once natural features exist, texts can describe roots, mountains, waters, courts, and distant regions. Pangu's tale does not need to govern those later worlds in order to remain powerful. It can simply be one account of how a world acquired separable forms. The conversion of body into landscape also gives the story a lingering stillness after the act of division. Pangu does not remain a ruler of the finished world, issuing later decisions. In the familiar pattern, his transformed body has become part of the setting. The maker is absorbed into what has been made. That ending separates Pangu from later heavenly figures, whose authority is imagined through courts and offices. His story is not about administering a cosmos. It is about the emergence of a cosmos with enough separate features for later stories to inhabit. The distinction keeps the creation figure from being made into an emperor before the evidence requires one. The egg story also preserves a contrast between enclosure and expanse. Its first world is contained. Its later world is spread through natural features. The transformation makes a cosmos feel available for habitation without needing to describe ordinary human settlement. It is enough that distinct land, water, and weather can now be imagined. The story remains complete without demanding that its world be a universal beginning. Its later written witnesses preserve a distinct creation image, one whose transformation leaves space for other accounts of order. The egg opens. Light finds a higher place and heavy matter a lower one. A body becomes landscape. The sequence is memorable because every stage creates room for the next. Yet a made world is not automatically a mapped world. It can contain mountains, waters, and distant margins without telling anyone how those places relate. Another old text approaches that question by setting strange beings and sacred places in particular directions. Another old text approaches that question by setting strange beings and sacred places in particular directions. The classic of mountains and seas does not offer a comfortable itinerary, nor does it provide a single reliable chronology of all mythic time. It gives a world in which location itself helps establish relation. Mountains, seas, rivers, creatures, and sacred places appear through a geography that is stranger than an ordinary road map. A reader moves by placement. What lies beyond a range, beside a river, or toward a direction matters, because the text makes distinction through where things belong. Its beings are not simply gathered into a cabinet of curiosities. Their positions help make a cosmos legible. Modern scholarship on the work argues that spatial placement and differentiation are part of its cosmological work. That claim is useful because it keeps the text from becoming a parade of marvelous creatures. The important question is not merely what unusual being appears next. It is how a world can be organized when mountains, waters, sacred sites, and inhabitants are set in relation to one another. The reading experience has a traveler-like quality, though the text need not be treated as a travel account in a modern sense. Each place creates a boundary and an approach. A mountain is not only scenery. A river is not only a blue line between banks. A sacred place is not merely a name. The locations become points in an ordered field, and the beings associated with them gain part of their character from their placement. This differs from Pangu's cosmic body becoming the natural world. Pangu's story supplies a transformation from one form into another. The classic of mountains and seas works after such a world can be imagined. It asks how a reader might move through an already differentiated expanse. Its answer is not an abstract chart. It is a sequence of places where the strange is given an address. That does not make the work a reliable historical atlas. It should not be used to construct a firm timeline for gods, heroes, and creatures from every later tradition. The text has its own complex nature and its own cosmological work. It can be read as an arrangement of space and relation, without being made to prove where every story began. There is a quiet discipline in this kind of ordering. A creature at a margin is not just an interruption to the ordinary world. Its margin helps define a center, while the center makes the margin imaginable. Directions and distances give difference a place to rest. The unknown is not dissolved, but it is situated. The text also keeps wonder from floating free. A reader may encounter a mountain, then a river, then a being associated with one of them, but the sequence does not require a fixed moral at every turn. It is enough that the world has many regions, and that relation can be described through placement. The cosmos is populated without becoming a single household in which every inhabitant must be related by blood. This is a useful corrective to the urge for one canon. The classic of mountains and seas can stand beside a Han cosmogony, a later creation narrative, and changing images of culture heroes without being absorbed by any of them. Its work is different. It makes strangeness geographical. It allows the world to have edges, roots, sacred concentrations, and remote presences. The text's spatial imagination is not a promise that every place can be reached or every inhabitant neatly classified. Its value lies in the act of placing. A strange creature becomes part of a world when it is associated with a site, a direction, or a route. A sacred mountain becomes more than scenery when it is placed within a network of other mountains and waters. That kind of arrangement can feel distant from modern mapping, which often aims at fixed scale and measured accuracy. The classic of mountains and seas is useful here for another purpose. It shows that geography can be cosmological. where something is may help explain what it is. Relation becomes a form of knowledge, even when the world being described contains marvels beyond ordinary experience. The work, therefore, gives a different answer to uncertainty from the shell dragon that follows. An excavated object has a material location, but leaves much of its original meaning unstated. This text gives places a narrative relation, but should not be treated as a transparent record of physical terrain. Both forms of evidence require patience. Each gives something firm and leaves something unresolved. The reader's movement through mountains and seas is also a movement through distinctions. Near and far, center and margin, river and ridge, creature and place. Such pairs make the world readable without eliminating its strangeness. The text does not make every edge familiar. It makes the edge part of an ordered field. This is not the order of a palace archive, with every item assigned a single office. It is an order of proximity and direction. One place leads thought toward another. A mountain can mark a region, a river can establish a relation, and a creature can belong to a location without being converted into a mere symbol. The spatial arrangement also makes the text a useful companion to the earlier cosmogonies. Those accounts asked how a world forms or is repaired. The classic of mountains and seas asks how a formed world can be differentiated across its expanse. Its answer is not a final map, but a set of relations held through place. The work does not need to yield a settled itinerary in order to do this cosmological work. Its places can remain strange, and its relations can remain densely imagined. The reader is given an organized world, not a promise that all its regions will become ordinary. Such a world is not made smaller by its unknown margins. The margins give it room, and the text's placement of beings and sites gives that room a patterned form. Among those possibilities, dragons will eventually appear as a long-lived visual tradition before they become courtly emblems or devotional figures. It is worth pausing at one actual place where an early dragon shape was laid out from a very ordinary material, shell by shell, in a tomb far older than the later meanings that would gather around it. At Shi Shwe Po in Henan, tomb M45 contains a shell mosaic that a Cornell exhibition identifies as an exceptionally early dragon representation. The tomb gives this ancient shape a fixed material setting, long before later meanings gathered around dragon imagery. The estimate attached to it is about 6,500 years. That distance in time can make any object feel like an answer to a very large question. A dragon is present, formed from shells in a burial setting, and the image has endured long enough to be named within a much later history of dragon imagery. It is a remarkable object. It is not, by itself, a complete explanation of what dragons meant across all those centuries. The shells are important partly because they keep the scene material. This is not an abstract word preserved in a book. It is a shape made by arranging small, hard pieces. Someone selected them and placed them so that a dragon form could emerge. The tomb gives the object a particular setting. The excavation gives it a particular location. Those facts make the image more solid, even as its full ancient meaning remains beyond easy recovery. An early image can invite very ambitious claims. It can be used to suggest that one unbroken idea traveled unchanged from prehistory into every later robe, story, temple, and modern phrase. The evidence does not require that conclusion. The mosaic supports an early dragon representation and a long visual history. It does not prove a stable meaning through millennia, and it does not establish an ancient ethnic origin for every later expression about dragons. Restraint is not a failure of imagination. It lets the object keep its own scale. The shell dragon is already more than enough, a very old form in a specific tomb, made from a specific material, surviving into a present where people still recognize its outline. The gap between its makers and later interpreters should remain visible. That gap is part of what makes the artifact quiet rather than convenient. The dragon introduced here is therefore a visual tradition before it is anything else. It is not yet a member of a complete pantheon, not yet a court badge, not yet an automatic sign of any one religious system. The shape has a history ahead of it, but histories do not run in a straight line merely because a later observer can recognize a resemblance. There is something fitting about shells carrying the earliest secure point in this thread. Shells come from water, are gathered by hand, and retain a pale, hard surface long after the creature that formed them is gone. Arranged into a dragon, they make a composite body from many small pieces. The image has survived through the same kind of uneven transmission that preserves old texts and altered pictures, not as a perfect message, but as a trace. The tomb does not speak in a finished sentence. Its dragon shape can be described, dated approximately, located, and placed within a visual history. Beyond that, certainty thins. This is not an invitation to fill the silence with a larger story than the object can bear. It is an invitation to notice how much an object can say while still refusing to say everything. The dragon's long visual history is therefore best imagined as a sequence of new settings, not a single thread pulled tight across time. An image may remain recognizable, while its materials, audience, purpose, and value all change. Shells in a tomb are not silk in a painting. Neither is the same as a regulated court design. Recognition is the beginning of inquiry, not its conclusion. The Shwe Po mosaic offers a useful discipline in evidence. It is exceptional because of its early date and its clear dragon form. Those strengths should not be turned into claims it cannot make. The tomb does not provide a complete record of belief. It does not explain every later use of dragons. It does, however, put a material dragon image far back in time and make later assertions of a wholly recent visual tradition impossible. The artifact also gives the story a place where hands once worked, a mosaic is assembled. It depends on selection, placement, and patience. Even when the reasons for that arrangement cannot be recovered with certainty, the arrangement itself remains. It is an ancient decision made visible through durable pieces. The Cornell exhibition places this image within a long history of dragons, but the phrase long history should not become an excuse for smooth continuity. Long histories contain breaks, altered uses, and missing explanations. The tomb mosaic is an early point of evidence, not a document that silently contains every later meaning. Its restraint is part of its power. The shell form can be admired as a composed image, while the ancient beliefs around it remain only partly known. Such partial knowledge is normal in the study of old objects. The object is present, its context is named, and its broader significance must remain carefully bounded. Such evidence is quieter than a sweeping origin claim. It leaves the dragon neither empty nor overburdened. The form has a past that can be dated approximately, a place that can be named, and a material that can be described. Beyond that, later history must be allowed to develop through its own objects and institutions. The contrast with later court use is therefore already present in the object itself. Shells do not announce a regulation. Their dragon form carries no surviving imperial decree. It has a place, a material, and an approximate age, while its ancient meanings remain respectfully unresolved. The next setting will attach a far more exact social meaning to the dragon. That later precision makes the quiet uncertainty around the ancient mosaic all the more important. Much later, dragon imagery acquired particular political uses in imperial settings. There the image could be regulated with a precision that the shell mosaic cannot disclose. Claws, cloth, and courtly rank would turn a broad and ancient form into a sign whose authority depended on being reserved for one figure at the center of a human administration. Imperial institutions would later give the dragon a tightly regulated role, reserving specific forms for the ruler at the center of human administration. The dragon, introduced through the shell mosaic at Shue Po, appears in this much later imperial setting with a sharply limited function. Cornell's exhibition on Chinese imperial dragons notes that the five-clawed dragon was restricted to the emperor. The detail is small enough to be overlooked, but it shows how visual power can work through regulation. An image is no longer simply admired or repeated. Its particular form is assigned a rank. The number of claws helps establish distance between the emperor and those around the court. This is not the meaning of every dragon image. It cannot be carried backward to the shell mosaic, and it should not be carried outward to every dragon in story, art, or ritual. The early artifact and the later court emblem belong to a long visual history, but not to one unchanging message. In the imperial case, the dragon's force is particular. It becomes an artistic sign of sovereign authority. The restriction gives the image an administrative quality. Authority is not expressed only through a throne, a decree, or a spoken title. It can be woven into cloth and inspected in a form. The 5 claws make rank visible within the visual language of the court. A dragon is asked to do paperwork without paper, which is an efficient arrangement if one happens to be the emperor. The rule also keeps the point material. It concerns a particular feature of a particular court image, not a misty claim that every dragon somehow carried imperial power. Rank is made visible by a form that can be recognized, repeated, and reserved. The courtly use also shows how older forms can be given new tasks. A dragon did not need to carry the same meaning in every time and place to remain recognizable. Its shape could enter a political order and become part of the distinction between ruler and subject. The image retained a long past, but its imperial use depended on contemporary rules, courtly display, and the authority that enforced such distinctions. This is why the word dragon must be handled slowly. It can name a shape on an ancient tomb mosaic, an emblem of imperial rank, a figure in a religious painting, or a presence in popular stories. Recognition across those settings is real. Sameness of meaning is not. A history that flattens the differences would make the dragon simpler than the evidence allows. The 5-clawed restriction is especially helpful because it is so concrete. It keeps imperial symbolism from drifting into vague claims about eternal national character. A later court made one dragon form a reserved sign. That is enough. It describes a historical use of imagery without demanding that every earlier shell or later painting endorse the same political message. There is a certain formality to the arrangement. The dragon is not required to roar or threaten. It needs only to appear where rules say it belongs. Its authority is procedural. The court converts an old and flexible image into a regulated mark of distance. Cloth, claw, and rank become part of the same ordered display. Regulation also reveals something about the court's relationship to images. A dragon is not simply an ornament added after authority has been established elsewhere. In this setting, the image participates in the performance of authority. Its form carries a rule, and the rule becomes legible through the form. Political hierarchy reaches into decoration, because decoration can make hierarchy appear natural and immediate. Yet the courtly setting is only one historical frame. The dragon remains broader than the emperor's reserved emblem, just as the earlier shell mosaic remains broader than the later court rule. The task is to keep the frames separate without pretending they have nothing to do with one another. A recognizable image can travel. It can also be claimed, limited, and given a special purpose along the way. The Cornell exhibition's point about 5 claws permits a precise statement without a grand theory. Later imperial use gave particular dragon forms political force, and the 5-clawed dragon was restricted to the emperor. That is a record of visual regulation. It does not establish a permanent essence of the dragon or a total explanation for every use of the form. This kind of precision is a useful relief. Large words about power can float away from the object. Here, the point stays close to the visual fact. A feature of the depicted body, the number of claws, takes on administrative significance. The image is asked to preserve a distinction that the court considers important. The dragon can therefore be both old and newly useful. Its great age as a visual form does not prevent later institutions from assigning it a narrower role. In fact, familiar forms may be especially effective when authority wants to make itself visible. The court borrows no explanation from the ancient tomb. It creates a particular setting in which an old image is made to carry rank. The reserved five-clawed form suggests that imperial visual culture could be precise without needing to explain itself in a written argument each time. Recognition did part of the work. The difference in claws could signal a difference in status to those accustomed to the court's visual language. That precision should remain attached to its setting. It describes later imperial use, not an inherited meaning that lay hidden inside every previous dragon image. The history becomes clearer when authority is treated as one episode in a much broader career of forms. Courtly display can make a sign look permanent, but the history of the dragon does not stop at the court gate. Its visual flexibility remains available elsewhere. Authority could regulate one form without exhausting the figure's possible settings or relations. The next documented object makes that flexibility concrete without needing to deny the political force of the imperial emblem. The setting also prepares a useful reversal. An imperial dragon might seem fully claimed by power, yet dragon figures could appear in very different scenes. In a Ming silk painting held by the Smithsonian, a dragon king is not arranged as a badge of human sovereignty. He appears in a devotional Buddhist setting, where reverence, rather than rank, gives the image its immediate relation. That courtly restriction did not exhaust the dragon's religious settings. A Ming silk painting held by the Smithsonian presents a dragon king within a Buddhist act of reverence, not as an emblem of human sovereignty. The work is titled The Dragon King, Revering the Buddha. The Smithsonian's record describes it as a Ming Dynasty silk painting attributed to Chen Hongshou. Its title states the scene plainly. A dragon king reveres the Buddha. The action changes the terms established by the imperial court. The dragon figure is not being used to distinguish one human ruler from others. It is part of a devotional composition. The material matters. Silk is not the shell mosaic from Shi Shui Po, and the painting is not court cloth regulated by claw count. It belongs to a named museum collection with a recorded collection history and exhibition record. Those details do not make the object less mysterious. They make its later life traceable in ways an excavated ancient image cannot be. The attribution to Chen Hongshou should remain an attribution, as the museum record gives it. The Ming date should remain a date for this object, not a claim about when every dragon king story took shape. Museum documentation can be wonderfully precise about a work's title, material, collection, and exhibition. It cannot turn one painting into a complete map of all dragon traditions. Still, the painting is a strong case for coexistence. The Dragon King appears in a Buddhist devotional scene, while the broader world of Chinese religious culture also includes Daoist and popular traditions. The object does not require a tidy division in which dragons belong permanently to one camp and never cross another threshold. Its scene quietly displays an interwoven visual culture. The categories themselves need care. Buddhism, Daoism, and popular religion can help describe different institutions, texts, and practices. They are not sealed rooms with locked doors. Images, figures, rituals, and stories can be shared, adapted, or placed near one another without surrendering all distinction. The Dragon King before the Buddha gives that complexity a single, manageable form. There is no need to produce a full list of Dragon Kings here. The painting supplies one figure in one setting. It is enough to follow the relation created by the title and the scene. A Dragon King revering the Buddha. The image gains force from its restraint. A broad figure with a long visual history is given a particular devotional posture in a particular early modern object. The object also corrects the temptation to choose one true dragon. The shell mosaic does not settle the painting's religious meaning. The imperial claw restriction does not explain the gesture of reverence. The painting does not erase either earlier case. Each remains in its own setting. The same recognizable broad figure can be activated by different systems of value. That is how a layered history becomes more than a list. An object changes the question. With the shell dragon, the question was what can be safely said about a very early image. At court, it was how an image could mark sovereign authority. In this silk painting, the question becomes how a dragon figure could inhabit devotion. None of the answers cancel the others. The collection history and exhibition record do more than provide museum details. They show that the painting has had a life after its making, moving through institutions that describe, preserve, and display it. That modern record is not the same as the Ming devotional setting, but it helps locate the object as an object rather than allowing it to dissolve into a generalized myth. The title also preserves a relationship more important than an inventory. The Dragon King is revering the Buddha. The scene makes reverence its action. A figure associated elsewhere with water, power, or courtly imagery is placed in a posture that directs attention beyond himself. The composition makes no need to choose a single permanent identity for the dragon. This is the value of a named object. Broad accounts of cultural interchange can become vague very quickly. A silk painting attributed to Chen Hongshou, held by a museum and given a particular title, gives the idea a surface and a date range. It permits an observation about interwoven religious culture without requiring an unsupported survey of every temple, text, or region. The object also makes category boundaries less rigid while preserving their usefulness. The painting is a Buddhist devotional scene. The Dragon King can be considered within a wider field that includes Daoist and popular traditions. These statements do not merge the traditions into one. They describe a setting in which a figure could cross the neat lines a later chart might prefer. The scene is also a reminder that devotion can rearrange status. A figure with royal language in his name is defined here by reverence. The title does not ask the Dragon King to rule the composition. It places him in relation to the Buddha. That relation is sufficient to change the immediate meaning of the dragon figure. The Ming painting thus preserves a single documented encounter rather than a general rule. Its strength is its specificity. The work can complicate an overly tidy account of religious traditions precisely because it remains one object with a known title, material, and attribution. The broad dragon history has now passed through tomb, court, and painting. Each case has a different kind of evidence: archaeology, an exhibition account of imperial symbolism, and a museum record. Their differences make the sequence stronger. The figure is never required to remain the same in order for the history to remain connected. The painting's devotional relation also prepares a wider thought about organized sacred worlds. Reverence, role, and rank can be pictured without reducing all figures to one category. Its quiet composition makes room for difference rather than settling it. A courtly vocabulary may be used to understand heaven, even while individual objects preserve other kinds of religious relation. A devotional scene also makes a larger ordered world imaginable. Figures can have ranks, duties, reverence, and places within a cosmos without all of them being identical kinds of gods. In popular religious accounts, heaven itself is often pictured through a structure familiar from human government: a court of offices where petitions may be sent, and local responsibilities are carefully assigned. This devotional image points beyond a courtly emblem toward broader sacred arrangements. In popular religion, heaven could be imagined as a court of offices with petitions, local duties, and a ruler at its summit. Columbia University's account of Chinese popular religion describes the Jade Emperor as the ruler presiding over such a divine bureaucracy. The comparison with government is not casual decoration. Heaven, earth, and the underworld are presented as domains, and the heavenly court is modeled on imperial administration. There are jurisdictions and offices. A cosmos can be imagined not only as weather, mountains, and distant stars, but as an ordered system in which responsibility is distributed. The Jade Emperor enters this account as heaven's ruler. That title should not be widened into an uncontested statement about every Daoist school, every dynasty, or every community. Columbia's description concerns a popular religious cosmology. It gives a useful view of how divine order could be understood in relation to familiar human institutions, without claiming that all Chinese religious life fit one official chart. At household scale, the kitchen god makes the bureaucracy concrete. This divine office is connected with the household rather than a remote edge of the sky. At local scale, the city god gives another point of contact, tied to the life of a particular city and its community. The names are less important here than the logic they reveal. A vast order can have offices close to ordinary domestic and civic concerns. Prayer could be imagined as a written petition burned for delivery. The act joins material practice to administrative imagination. Words are written. Paper is burned. The petition is not simply released into empty air. It is sent within an imagined system where messages have a root and authority has an address. That image has an unusual calm. It does not depend on a god appearing suddenly in a storm or issuing a mysterious answer. It depends on a procedure. The petitioner has a request. The court has channels. The divine world is imagined with something like a clerical apparatus, though perhaps with better endurance than most earthly offices can manage. The heavenly bureaucracy also makes room for many figures without forcing them into one undifferentiated crowd. Different gods can have domains, just as officials can have jurisdictions. The arrangement does not mean that every story is merely an administrative allegory. It means that government offered a powerful model for thinking about divine responsibility, hierarchy, and communication. The model is especially useful after the Dragon King's devotional painting. There, one figure occupied a relation of reverence within a Buddhist visual setting. Here, the emphasis is not on one painting, but on an account of lived religious logic. A person might understand heaven through offices and petitions, because offices and petitions were recognizable means of organizing human affairs. This does not make the divine court dull. It gives it texture. A petition has to be written. A household has a god tied to its concerns. A city has a local guardian. Heaven has a ruler whose court resembles a human administration. The cosmos becomes imaginable through tasks rather than through a bare list of sacred names. The model of a bureaucracy helps explain why heaven can feel both distant and near in this account. The Jade Emperor presides at the highest level, but the presence of local and household gods prevents the divine order from remaining only a remote abstraction. The kitchen god belongs to the scale of the home. The city god belongs to the scale of a community. Domains make a large cosmos manageable. The burned petition is similarly modest. It does not require a vision or an extraordinary interruption. It is an act with a root imagined for it. The paper gives a request a physical form, and burning gives the request a means of delivery within the cosmological logic. The procedure matters because it allows ordinary concerns to be addressed to an order beyond the ordinary. This is popular religion understood as practice as well as belief. A court of gods is not merely a catalog maintained in a book. It is an imagined structure that makes certain acts sensible. Petition, office, jurisdiction, and ruler fit together because They resemble a familiar way human societies organize responsibility. There is room here for variation, and the source should not be made to deny it. The Jade Emperor need not be proclaimed the universal supreme figure for every setting. The account has force precisely because it is identified as one popular religious cosmology. It describes a way of arranging heaven rather than closing every question about Chinese religious life. The administrative model is not dry when it is connected to practice. It gives a household a relation to a larger order through the kitchen god. It gives a city a guardian through the city god. It gives a request a root through the burned petition. Those links make the divine world imaginable at several scales, without requiring a person to stand directly before the highest heavenly ruler. The model also understands that large systems require intermediaries. A distant court can remain meaningful because local offices make its jurisdiction present. This is a familiar human solution to distance, carried into a cosmological setting. The divine bureaucracy is patterned after imperial governance because governance offers a language for responsibility, rank, and communication. The result is not a universal map with every office fixed beyond dispute. It is an account of popular religious imagination, and popular religion is lived through particular communities and practices. Its court can be orderly without being uniform. Its ruler can be important without becoming the single answer to every theological question. The petition is perhaps the clearest material expression of this logic. Writing turns a concern into a document. Burning turns the document into a delivery. The action assumes that heaven is not merely a distant direction, but an organized domain capable of receiving an appeal. That is a profound idea made through a humble piece of paper. The hierarchy is therefore not only vertical, it also reaches outward from heaven toward house and city, and inward from a broad cosmology toward an individual request. That movement makes the divine bureaucracy more than a distant metaphor. It becomes a structure through which particular concerns can be imagined as heard. The arrangement also leaves a curious opening. If heaven can contain offices and jurisdictions, could a remembered human life enter that ordered world as well? Columbia's account gives examples of people understood to have become gods after exemplary lives. Their presence makes the boundary between human memory and divine office more porous than a rigid chart might suggest. Human memory can enter this ordered world without becoming merely another office. Ma Dizu and Guan Yu are cited in the popular religious account as people understood to have become gods after exemplary lives. The point is not to turn either figure into a compressed biography. The available source gives them as examples within a larger explanation of divine domains and celestial administration. Their remembered human lives could become part of the religious world, and their later divine standing could be understood within the ordered arrangement of heaven's offices. Ma Dizu and Guan Yu therefore show a social logic as much as a story. Human reputation exemplary action, memory, and religious recognition do not have to remain entirely outside the divine order. A person may be remembered in a way that makes divine status imaginable. The heavenly court is not only populated by beings who are always remote from human life. That does not mean every honored person became a god, or that every divine figure began as a human. The source does not provide a simple rule of promotion. It gives examples that make the boundary less absolute. The court can include figures whose significance is rooted in remembered human existence, while other divinities belong to quite different kinds of stories and practices. The distinction matters because another category waits nearby: Daoist immortals. It would be easy to call all transformed or elevated humans immortals and move on. That would blur traditions the sources ask to keep apart. Ma Dizu and Guan Yu are introduced here through a popular religious account of humans understood to have become gods. Daoist immortals concern a different aspiration, one focused on transcending ordinary existence rather than simply joining a divine bureaucracy. The difference can be felt in the questions each category raises. For a deified human, the question is how a remembered life enters the religious and social order of offices, domains, and recognition. For an immortal, the question is how a historical or legendary person might exceed ordinary human limits through a different set of practices and stories. Both concern the human and the more than human. They do not do so in the same way. The earlier petition scene helps clarify this without needing to repeat it. A heavenly bureaucracy has places for responsibility and communication. Deified humans can be imagined within that arrangement because their remembered lives become attached to divine roles. The logic is relational. It is about how a community understands an exemplary person continuing to matter. That continuing matter need not be reduced to a cold office chart. Memory is not only a file in a celestial archive. It is kept through stories, images, names, practices, and the places where a figure is honored. Yet, the bureaucratic model gives those practices a structure. It makes room for local concerns and local divinities without requiring a single distant ruler to perform every task. The result is a cosmos with many thresholds. A human life can be remembered as exemplary. A god can have a domain. A petition can be imagined as traveling through a court. None of these claims needs to make heaven identical with a modern government or to make every religious tradition agree. They describe one influential way popular religion could order relations between human communities and divine powers. The examples are especially helpful because they make an abstract boundary concrete without demanding more detail than the source provides. Ma Dizu and Guan Yu are not introduced here as characters in an adventure or as proof of a single rule. They are remembered human figures cited by the popular religion account, evidence that divine recognition could be imagined as continuing from an exemplary life. That idea places memory near administration without reducing one to the other. A divine office has a domain and a relationship to a community. A remembered life has stories and forms of honor attached to it. When the two meet, the cosmos becomes more socially porous. Human action and reputation can remain meaningful after a life is over. It also gives the heavenly court an uneven, lived quality. The court is not only a distant hierarchy of nameless officials. It can include local figures whose importance has been shaped by the communities that remember them. That does not make the whole system democratic or simple. It makes it responsive to the fact that religious worlds are inhabited through particular names and particular ties. The distinction from immortality remains necessary. A person understood to have become a god after an exemplary life is not automatically being described as a Daoist immortal. The categories may stand near one another in a broad narration about beings beyond ordinary human status, but their sources, aspirations, and functions differ. Keeping that difference clear gives both traditions more room. The courtly metaphor does not erase the human origin of these examples. In fact, it makes that origin more interesting. An office may be imagined as part of heaven's order, while the remembered person associated with that office keeps a connection to human action, reputation, and community memory. The divine world can therefore be populated by figures whose importance begins in stories of lived exemplary conduct. This is not a claim that recognition works the same way everywhere. The source offers Ma Dizu and Guan Yu as illustrations, not as a complete theory of all divinization. It is enough to see what the examples make possible. The line between human and divine can be crossed in a popular religious imagination without becoming irrelevant to the communities that remember the person. Such a model has an ordinary quality beneath its grandeur. Communities remember people. They distinguish certain lives as unusually significant. They honor figures through local and broader practices. The account of human beings becoming gods places that process within a larger cosmos of domains and offices. The result is neither a simple biography nor an abstract theology. It is a way of preserving a relation. A remembered human life can continue to matter in divine terms, while its continuing significance is shaped by the social world that holds the memory. From that edge, the Daoist immortal appears less like another official waiting for an appointment. The immortal belongs to stories of longevity, transformation, qi, healing, and release from ordinary limitations. The path is not a promotion within a court. It is a longer and stranger effort to alter what a human life can be. The path is not a promotion within a court. It is a longer and stranger effort to alter what a human life can be. Daoist immortals are described by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as historical or legendary persons who have transcended ordinary existence. That description is deliberately broader and more careful than a parade of magical feats. An immortal may be associated with longevity, transformation, mastery of qi, healing, and other extraordinary capacities. These traits point to a life beyond ordinary limitations. They do not make every immortal into a god, nor do they make the aspiration identical with the deified humans introduced in the popular religious account of heaven. The difference is useful. Ma Dizu and Guan Yu were examples of humans understood to have become gods after exemplary lives. Daoist immortals belong to another thread, one in which ordinary existence itself is the condition to be transcended. The goal is not simply a place in an administration. It is a transformed relation to life, body, time, and the limits that usually govern them. Early hagiographic collections preserve this field of possibility. The Li A Xian Jwan and the Shen Xian Jwan gather accounts of immortals. Such collections do not function like a modern register that can settle every detail about a historical person. They are hagiography, literature shaped around exemplary and extraordinary lives. Their importance lies partly in showing that immortality was narrated through persons, stories, and remembered capacities. Longevity is perhaps the most immediately understandable trait. A long life suggests a body that has ceased to obey an ordinary measure. Transformation carries the thought further. The body itself may not remain fixed in the way everyday experience expects. Mastery of qi brings the older cosmological term into a new setting, no longer as the material of an early cosmogony, but as something associated with accomplished human transcendence. Healing makes the immortal's capacities touch the vulnerable body of ordinary life. It would be easy to flatten all of this into a simple opposition between philosophical Daoism and religious Daoism. The Stanford account, following Fabrizio Pregadio, cautions against that older Western division. The history is not well served by separating abstract thought from practice, institution, ritual, and aspiration, as though they belonged to unrelated worlds. Immortals appear precisely where such divisions become difficult to maintain. That caution makes the subject clearer. Daoist traditions include texts, communities, practices, and figures whose interests cannot be packed into one narrow category. An immortal is not merely a fantasy added to a system of ideas, and not merely a religious ornament placed beside philosophy. The stories of transcendence are part of the broader material through which people considered what life could become. The source base here does not support a catalog of the 8 immortals, and none is needed. A list of names would create the feeling of completeness without giving the figures the evidence they deserve. The larger pattern is sufficient. Historical or legendary people are imagined as crossing ordinary limits, and their stories preserve the qualities by which that crossing could be recognized. The 2 hagiographic collections set a useful limit on the subject. They preserve lives in which extraordinary capacities matter, but they do not turn immortality into a simple test that can be applied from outside the tradition. A person is not made into an immortal merely because a later reader finds the story unusual. The category belongs to accounts shaped around transcendence. Longevity, transformation, mastery of qi, and healing are meaningful there because they describe an altered condition of existence, not because they provide a collection of curiosities. That is why the words historical or legendary can remain side by side without needing to be forced apart. The source does not ask for a modern verdict on every person named in such a collection. It identifies a kind of life that could be remembered through both human particularity and extraordinary possibility. Hagiography gives that possibility a narrative home, preserving a person with a name, a body, a remembered capacity, and a relation to ordinary limits. This also keeps the immortal from becoming a replacement for the heavenly officials already encountered. A court office concerns a domain, a responsibility, and a relation to community. The immortal story concerns a person who has gone beyond ordinary existence. The categories can meet in a broad religious world without becoming interchangeable. One is not a promotion list for the other. Their difference allows remembered human figures, divine offices, ritual practices, and Daoist aspirations to remain distinct without being sealed away from one another. The slow quality of longevity is especially useful here. It does not depend on a sudden contest or a final conquest. It imagines time itself taking another shape around a person. Transformation and healing add other ways of thinking about a body, no longer confined to familiar expectations. The details should remain modest, because the source gives traits and collections rather than a uniform account of every immortal. Even so, the pattern is clear enough. Ordinary human limits were not only endured or mourned. In Daoist hagiographic memory, they could be imagined as conditions that a person might somehow pass beyond. There is a low, steady pressure in the idea. Ordinary life has age, illness, change, and an ending. The immortal stands as a figure for whom those conditions have been altered, whether through longevity, transformation, qi, healing, or another extraordinary capacity. The stories do not erase the human problem. They make its limits visible by imagining someone who has gone beyond them. The hagiographic form is important for another reason. It allows extraordinary capacities to be told through a life rather than laid out as an abstract theory. A collection can present a person, the conditions of that person's transformation, and the signs by which transcendence is recognized. The result is not a modern biography, but it is more human than a bare category. The immortal also gives the body a special place in the story. Earlier, the Hy non-Diza linked the body to cosmic patterns. Here, Daoist narratives can imagine the body exceeding its ordinary duration or condition. The connection should not be forced into a single continuous doctrine, but both threads treat embodiment as more than a neutral container. The body is where limits are felt and where transformation may be imagined. Healing belongs in this field without needing to be made spectacular. It is one of the capacities associated with immortals in the Stanford account. In a world where ordinary bodies age and fail, healing makes the figure's extraordinary condition touch the needs of those who remain ordinary. Longevity and healing are not identical, but they both turn attention toward the vulnerability of human life. The tales may involve historical or legendary persons, and the distinction need not always be resolved. Hagiography does not remove the question of history, it frames it differently. A person can be remembered through an account that is interested in transcendence more than ordinary documentation. The sources category holds both possibilities together without requiring false certainty. The term immortal is therefore best treated as an aspiration and a narrative category rather than a casual synonym for any impressive divine figure. It identifies people who have gone beyond ordinary existence in the traditions that tell of them. Their extraordinary capacities are signs of that crossing, not a list of powers to be collected for its own sake. Longevity gives this aspiration its slowest image. Instead of a sudden escape, it imagines duration altered. Transformation gives it a more radical image, in which ordinary bodily limits no longer settle the whole story. Mastery of qi and healing connect the aspiration to the body's vitality and fragility. Together, the traits make transcendence a matter of lived condition rather than a distant title. Brigadio's caution about the philosophical and religious binary matters because the material refuses to stay in either half. Stories of immortals involve ideas about life and transformation, but they also belong to texts, practices, institutions, and hagiographic memory. A clean division would make the traditions easier to label and harder to understand. The immortals remain human enough for their altered condition to be meaningful. Their stories begin from the limits that ordinary lives know, then imagine those limits changed. That is why the passage to death and the care of the dead follows naturally. Transcendence is one answer to mortality. The 10 courts provide another kind of answer, concerned not with escape, but with a continuing route. But not every narrative about death turns toward escape. Another set of traditions gives death an ordered route, not a final vanishing, and not an immortal release. There, the question becomes what happens to a person after death, and what the living might still do through texts and rites to care for that passage. Death in these traditions was imagined as a passage that still involved the living through texts and rites. The 10 magistrates of the Underworld give that passage a sequence of courts shaped by Buddhist and popular religious traditions. The model is administrative, though its setting is the realm of the dead, rather than the heavenly bureaucracy described earlier. A deceased person moves through successive courts. The 10 magistrates are a Chinese adaptation of Buddhist afterlife ideas into this courtly form. The arrangement makes judgment imaginable through offices, procedures, and stages, rather than through one final and eternal sentence. Stephen Tyser's study centers the medieval scripture on the 10 kings and the death practices associated with it. The text matters because it anchors the subject in a particular historical Buddhist setting. It is not simply an old story told for fright. It belongs to rituals through which families sought to aid the dead. The underworld journey, therefore, has a social life among the living, shaped by obligation, memory, and acts of care. Columbia's broader account of popular religion describes 10 magistrates and a sequence in which punishment is followed by reincarnation. The distinction is important. This is not an eternal hell from which no movement is possible. Judgment belongs to a process that leads onward toward rebirth. The court model orders that process, even when the details of particular later images and practices vary. The 10th court is associated in Columbia's account with Meng and a potion of forgetfulness. The image is quiet in its own way. Before rebirth, memory is not carried forward unchanged. A courtly journey, family rites, judgment, and reincarnation meet at a point where an old life is not simply extended into the next one. The sources ask for restraint. The system has room for punishment, but a catalog of torments would tell the wrong kind of story and add little to the historical point. What matters here is the translation of afterlife concerns into a familiar administrative form. Courts succeed one another. Magistrates preside. The dead move through a structured process. Families respond through ritual care. The earlier heavenly bureaucracy makes the form recognizable without making the two systems identical. The Jade Emperor's court belongs to a popular religious imagination of heaven, organized through offices and petitions. The underworld courts arise in Buddhist and popular religious settings, where the fate of the dead is treated through successive judgment and reincarnation. Similar administrative language does not erase the difference in domain or purpose. There is a human practicality behind the arrangement. Death can leave an unfinished relation between the living and the dead. A sequence of courts gives that relation a path. Ritual gives relatives an action. The deceased is not simply removed beyond all concern. The journey remains socially present because families can seek to help. This is also why the medieval scripture on the 10 kings matters more than a detached list of judges. Its importance lies in a world of death practices. Text, ritual, family, and the imagined route after death belong together. A court is not merely a strange architecture somewhere below the earth. It becomes a way of giving grief and obligation a form. The courtly form has a familiar logic. Human administrations divide responsibility into offices, stages, and decisions. The afterlife account adapts that logic to a different concern: the movement of the dead. This does not make the underworld merely an earthly government in disguise. It shows how a known structure could make an unknown passage imaginable. The number 10 gives the route a sequence without requiring the narration to linger in every court. The source material supports the framework of successive magistrates and the movement toward reincarnation. It does not require a detailed tour of punishments, and such a tour would draw attention away from the more revealing historical feature. Families treated the journey as something to which ritual could respond. Meng's potion of forgetfulness is a small but striking detail because it places a limit on continuity. Rebirth is not simply the old person returning with every prior memory intact. Forgetfulness belongs to the transition. The account makes room for an onward movement, while acknowledging that another life is not a simple continuation of the last. Tyser's attention to the medieval scripture keeps the discussion connected to historical practice. The 10 kings were not only figures of a generalized imagination, they were central to a text and ritual setting in which those left behind sought to aid the deceased. The courts, therefore, have meaning on both sides of death, as an imagined route for the dead and as a focus for care among the living. This double meaning keeps the courts from becoming a spectacle. The magistrates matter because the process gives the dead a place in an ordered imagination, but also because that imagination gave relatives a reason and a framework for ritual action. A court can be formidable without becoming the whole point of the account. The broader popular religious account and the medieval Buddhist text should continue to be distinguished. One supplies an introductory picture of magistrates, reincarnation, and Meng's potion. The other directs attention to the scripture on the 10 kings and family rights. Their overlap is real, but each source carries a different historical emphasis. The route through 10 courts also turns the afterlife into time. It is not a single instant of judgment, nor an unchanging destination. The deceased moves through stages. The living can imagine that movement, mark it through ritual, and place their care within its sequence. The idea of reincarnation gives the sequence an eventual opening rather than an endless enclosure. The courts become most human when they are understood this way. They are a structure for obligations that death has not entirely ended. The living cannot accompany the dead in ordinary life, but rites and texts provide another kind of accompaniment. The pace can slow there. The magistrates, the 10th court, and the movement toward rebirth have established an administrative passage. Its most lasting human feature is not the judgment itself, but the care that relatives continue to offer. In the rites around a medieval Buddhist scripture, the living remained involved after death had changed the terms of every ordinary conversation. Medieval rites around the scripture on the 10 kings treated care for the dead as an ongoing obligation. Tyser's study places this scripture within family practices meant to aid a deceased relative, rather than a tale of a distant realm. Tyser's study emphasizes medieval Chinese Buddhist death practices and the ritual world around this scripture. That focus changes the scale of the story. Instead of standing outside the underworld and attempting to describe every office, attention returns to a family facing a recent loss. The journey of the dead becomes a continuing obligation for those who remain. Ritual action does not erase grief or provide a simple guarantee. The sources do not need to promise that much. They show that families had ways to respond. Texts could be used. Rites could be performed. Concern for the dead could take a form that joined remembrance to an imagined passage through the courts. This is a different use of narrative from a creation account or an imperial emblem. The Hy non-Diza could imagine a cosmos taking shape through differentiation. A court could restrict a dragon form to express rank. A silk painting could place a dragon king in reverence before the Buddha. The scripture on the 10 kings belonged to a setting where text and ritual met the ordinary fact that someone had died. That setting should remain historically specific. Taizer provides evidence for medieval Buddhist texts and family efforts to aid the dead. Columbia provides an introductory synthesis of the broader popular religious picture of 10 magistrates, judgment, reincarnation, and the 10th court. The two accounts overlap around the courtly image, but they do not make every later temple representation or ritual detail a direct feature of the medieval scripture. Keeping the distinction does not make the family seem colder. It makes it more honest. A text can become important because people use it in moments of obligation. A broader popular image can travel through later settings and remain recognizable. The relation between them is historical rather than automatic. Stories survive by being read, recited, painted, adapted, and brought into rituals. But each surviving form has its own time. The medieval setting gives that care a particular scale. The scripture on the 10 kings is not evidence for an abstract, timeless idea of the afterlife. Taizer's study places it among Chinese Buddhist death practices, where a deceased person and the people connected to that person remain the center of attention. The text's route through courts matters because it provides a framework for a relation that death has made difficult. The living cannot settle what happens beyond death by ordinary means, but they can respond through practices associated with the scripture. That response is quieter than certainty. To seek to aid the dead is not the same as claiming complete knowledge of the dead person's journey. It acknowledges a limit and gives obligation a form within it. The surviving account supports a medieval Buddhist context in which families performed rites for someone who had died. It does not require a claim that every family acted in the same manner, or that every later underworld custom can be carried back into that setting. Historical specificity leaves the ritual no less human. It prevents a real practice of care from becoming a vague custom of an imagined past. The courtly image can be understood through this use. A sequence of magistrates and stages gives an otherwise unknowable passage an order that can be named. The order does not remove grief, and it does not make relatives into spectators of a drama in another realm. It makes room for action on this side of death. A text can be kept, recited, or brought into a rite. Those acts connect memory to an imagined route without pretending that memory controls the route. The medieval scripture and Columbia's broader popular religious account remain distinct. The scripture anchors one textual and ritual history. Their overlap allows the courtly pattern to be recognized, but it does not turn the two sources into duplicates. One should remain an account of a medieval Buddhist world of death practices, The other remains a wider introduction to related popular religious imagery. The distinction also makes transmission more concrete. A scripture survives through copying, but its significance is renewed when it enters a rite, and a family remembers someone who has died. The later history of images and stories may extend beyond the medieval setting, yet that setting remains its own historical place. Care is not a general mood added after the fact. It is the reason the text and its ritual world mattered to people facing a death. The prospect of reincarnation gives the rites an onward direction. The dead are not imagined as fixed forever in one unchanging punishment. The route through judgment leads toward another birth. That movement need not be made cheerful. It is simply not a final locked door. The family acts within a cosmology where care may still matter after death and before the next stage begins. There is a modest dignity in that work. A relative may not possess an answer to death, but ritual offers something to do. Attend to a text, perform a rite, preserve a relation. The court metaphor gives the other world a structure. Family practice gives it a human center. What might otherwise be an abstract afterlife system becomes part of the work of mourning. This also helps explain why such stories endure in more than written form. They can persist because they are useful in a moment of loss, because images give them shape, because rituals give them a place, and because later communities can receive them through their own needs. Transmission is not only the copying of a sentence. It is an act repeated by people who find a story capable of accompanying an obligation. The family setting also lowers the temperature of the underworld material. Courts and magistrates can sound severe when removed from use. In the context of ritual, they become part of a grammar of care. The living do not need to master every detail of the other world. They need a way to acknowledge that a relation continues and that action remains possible. The source distinction remains a form of care as well. The medieval Buddhist scripture on the 10 Kings should not be made responsible for every later popular image of the underworld. Columbia's broader account helps describe the 10 magistrates in popular religion, while Tyser's study anchors a particular textual and ritual history. Keeping each source in place prevents a family rite from becoming a vague, timeless custom. Texts can travel in more than one sense. They are copied and transmitted, but they are also carried into the circumstances where their words acquire a new force. A scripture near death is not merely a document. It becomes part of a practice through which memory, duty, and hope are given an action. That action does not demand certainty about what lies after death. It accepts uncertainty by offering a form for it. The courtly route is imagined. The ritual is performed. The dead are remembered. The next life, in the account of reincarnation, remains ahead rather than fully known. This is a quieter kind of narrative endurance than a final answer. The rites are not simply an illustration of a doctrine. They make the doctrine socially present. A family can act because the account gives action a place. Care is directed towards someone no longer available to ordinary conversation, and the text helps hold that relation in view. The sources also suggest why later popular imagery could remain meaningful without being reduced to the medieval scripture. Images and accounts may share a courtly language while taking part in distinct historical settings. Transmission is not a straight line. It is a series of uses, adaptations, and memories that keep a form active. The idea of rebirth makes this activity forward-looking without making it triumphant. The dead move onward, and the living respond within the time that remains to them. The ritual does not turn mortality into a puzzle solved once and for all. It gives mortality a structure in which care can continue. This is a fitting point at which to notice the material forms of survival. A text survives because it is copied and used. An image survives because it is preserved or remade. A ritual survives because people perform it. Stories are not carried forward by words alone. After the courts have receded into the background, the materials that carried them remain: a scripture, rites, family memory, and later popular images. They join the many other traces gathered along the way. No single one contains the whole cosmos, but each shows people making relations among body, world, household, authority, and death. These materials belong together only in the modest sense that people used them to relate body, world, household, authority, and death. They remain distinct traces rather than a fixed canon, preserved beside one another across different times and settings. There is a hand text in which forms have not yet become distinct, and in which a body can be placed beside seasons, phases, divisions, and days. There are colored stones used by Nuwa to repair a damaged sky. There are paired images of Nuwa and Fuxi, and later images that give Fuxi another body and another kind of authority. There is Pangu within an egg, a figure whose familiar written accounts arrive in surviving sources later than the hand text. There is also a book of mountains, seas, creatures, and sacred places that makes location part of cosmic order. There is a dragon made from shells in a tomb at Shwe-Po, and a much later imperial use of a dragon form as a regulated sign of rank. There is a Ming silk painting attributed to Chen Hongshou, in which a dragon king reveres the Buddha. There are petitions imagined as traveling through a heavenly court, stories of immortals who exceed ordinary limits, and rites around a scripture for the dead. Placed in a row, these traces can seem to ask for one final arrangement. It is tempting to make the earliest object the origin of every later image, to make a familiar figure the parent of every other figure, or to turn a courtly model into the secret explanation of every religious practice. The materials resist that treatment. They come from different periods, media, institutions, and communities. The date of a transmitted text is not the same as the date of its present form. An archaeological object is not the same kind of evidence as a later literary retelling. A museum painting has a collection history that differs from the history of the figure shown within it. These distinctions are not fussy obstacles placed in the path of a good story. They are what allow each trace to remain in its own time. That is why the separate forms matter. Texts preserve phrasing, sequences, and arguments. Images preserve bodies, gestures, objects, and composition. Ritual systems preserve actions carried out among communities and families. Local gods preserve relations to households and places. Literary reworkings preserve the ability of a story to change while remaining recognizable. None has to become a substitute for all the others. The result is not disorder. It is a layered cosmos. An early writer can imagine Qi differentiating into a world. A later narrator can give Pangu the work of separation. An artist can place Fuxi and Nuwa within a paired visual convention. Then another image can revise Fuxi's form. A court can use the dragon to mark authority. A devotional painting can place a dragon king before the Buddha. A family can turn toward ritual when death has made ordinary help impossible. These are not pieces of one machine. They are relations that people made and remade. The old materials keep returning to familiar human concerns. How a world acquires order, how damage is repaired, how authority is imagined, how the body belongs to a larger pattern, how a remembered person may remain present, and how the dead may still be cared for. The answers differ because the settings differ. A scholar's text, a tomb mosaic, a silk painting, a household practice, a hagiographic collection, and a funeral scripture do not speak with one voice. Their differences are not an inconvenience to smooth away. They are the reason the history remains alive enough to follow slowly. In the end, the most durable image may be neither a single creator nor a final judge. It may be an arrangement. Stones fitted into a break, shells placed into a shape, words written onto paper, figures paired in an image, a text carried into a rite. Each is a way of making relation hold for a while. It is possible to feel the connections without forcing an answer to every gap. The early cosmogony, the repair myth, the altered images, the archaeological dragon, and the funeral text each take up a different problem. Their proximity in a modern narration does not make them simultaneous, and their occasional resemblance does not make them parts of a single original tale. The most careful continuity lies in transmission. Someone preserved a text. Someone made an image. Someone arranged shells in a tomb. Someone offered a petition, told a hagiographic life, or performed a rite for a dead relative. These acts are not identical, but they all carry forms forward. They allow a cosmos to be imagined again under changed circumstances. That continuity does not require a final declaration. It can remain in the small acts that make stories durable: placing, fitting, copying, painting, naming, and remembering. The forms change because the people and settings around them change. Their survival is not proof that they once meant only one thing. It is evidence that they could continue to matter in more than one way. The layered account also leaves room for modest uncertainty. Pangu's surviving written forms do not settle every question about older telling. An early dragon image does not settle every later use of dragons. A paired image of Fuxi and Nuwa does not decide all questions of their relationship. A medieval scripture does not explain every later underworld picture. The limits of each source are part of the shape of the history. This does not make the materials thin. It gives them depth. Each source has an edge, and the edges prevent one type of evidence from swallowing another. A text can remain a text. A painting can remain a painting. A ritual can remain an action. Their connection lies in the relations people have made among them, not in a final system imposed from above. The stories can therefore settle without becoming silent. A body remains beside a cosmos in an old hand passage. Colored stones hold a repaired sky. A dragon shape persists in shells, then acquires rank, then bows in a silk painting. A written petition rises toward heaven. A family turns to right after death. These are not one scene, but they can rest together as remembered forms. The sources remain incomplete, as old sources often do. They leave gaps between one account and another, and they do not always settle the questions later readers bring to them. Yet they have lasted through copying, painting, excavation, prayer, and retelling. In their separate times, they continue to offer a cosmos that is never quite one thing, but a patient collection of forms held briefly in relation.